Tonight, the Merlin Bird ID application created by the Lab of O's has its newest feature, Sound ID, which was added in spring of 2021 to help you identify over 1,000 birds by sound, even though you can't see them, or even when you can't see them. So tonight, Alli Smith, the project coordinator for Merlin, will be taking us on a deeper dive to learn how Sound ID was developed, how it works, and how we can help to expand Merlin to cover more species worldwide. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Alli.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen and make sure everything's working. And whoop. All right. Can you see the correct screen now? Okay, awesome. All right. Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I was really looking forward to meeting you all in person, but this does a good job too. And I'm sure I'll meet you out and about in Ithaca as I see you all birding in the area too. So well, I'm sure we'll meet. But yeah, my name is Alli Smith, and I'm the project coordinator for Merlin at the Cornell Lab. And before coming to Cornell, I spent the last like 6 or 7 years or so working as a biologist. I got to spend a summer up at Project Puffin, working on Eastern Egg Rock Island. And then I've spent the last 6 years down in Florida and Georgia, working with seabirds and shorebirds. And then most recently, I was a guide at an eco lodge for about 2 years. And through all of that work of my time before coming here to Cornell, I really seen and appreciated how powerful the birding community can be in making positive change for the environment. And I've become really passionate about encouraging people to get out birding for the first time and learn about the birds around them. And that's what gets me so excited about working with Merlin, because it's such a powerful tool for almost anybody anywhere in the world to learn about their local birds. And before I jump in, I'm sure a lot of you are already very familiar with the Lab of Ornithology, but I wanted to just quickly introduce some of you in case anyone's new. And Merlin is just one of the very, very many things we do here at the lab. A lot of you have heard of Merlin and eBird and probably use it almost every day, but we have a lot of other really cool projects happening here, like including the Great Backyard Bird Count that just wrapped up last month, and a lot of other really cool online resources like Bird Academy and Birds of the World. And here at the lab, our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. And that's a really big goal. And it's not something we can accomplish just on our own here in Ithaca. So most of what we do is done in partnership with a few hundred other organizations all around the world, and with the help of people like you. And Merlin, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, is a great example of what we can accomplish as a result of those partnerships. We know people won't act to conserve birds if they don't care about them. And the best way to start caring about them is by learning. So our goal with Merlin is to be a tool that anybody anywhere in the world can use to learn about the birds around them. And that's a really ambitious goal, but it's made possible with help from our partners who help us build bird packs and translate things into different languages, and with the help of birders around the world who are submitting eBird checklists to help Merlin learn, and submitting photos and sound recordings that we use both to train Merlin and to use in the field guide portion. And we're really particularly excited about the newest tool within Merlin, which is Sound ID, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's jump in. So during today's talk, I'm going to focus on Sound ID, and I want to answer these 4 questions this evening. So why did we build Sound ID? How do you use it? How does it work? And what exciting things are coming next? And I want to start by asking the question, why do birds sing? Why do they even make all these noises? So for a bird, singing can be really draining. It's very physically, like energetically expensive, and making all that noise can alert predators to the location of the bird. So why bother singing? Ornithologists are really still trying to understand the finer details of why birds sing, but in general, we like to say it's to defend and to impress. So male songbirds during the breeding season, like this beautiful Canada warbler here, will claim an area as their territory and defend it from other males. And they really want to find a high quality territory with plenty of food and good places to nest. And they want to make sure other males in the area stay out of their space, stay out of their territory, so they're not using their resources or sneaking in and mating with their females. And they do this by singing, where they're saying, hey, I'm here. This is my spot. Everybody else stay away. And singing is also a way to impress potential mates. We think that the quality of a song that a bird is singing is an indicator of the overall health of the bird. So if you're a female Canada warbler here, you're probably shopping around the forest, listening around to see which male in the area has the best song, because he probably is pretty healthy and should be a good partner in helping raise your chicks this summer. And birds don't just sing, they make calls and a lot of other noises too, and just different vocalizations that aren't necessarily used to defend a territory or attract a mate. They make these noises for a huge variety of reasons, but a really notable reason is to alert others of predators in the area. So a lot of different birds have alarm calls that others of their own species will recognize and react to. But the tufted titmouse is a cool example I wanted to share, because they have a really neat alarm call. It's not just titmice that respond to the titmouse alarm call, but other songbird species will recognize and respond appropriately to it. So if a titmouse is saying like, hey, there's a predator, it's not just other titmice that'll react, but it's like the warblers and the thrushes and everything else in the area will say, oh, the titmouse is saying there's a predator, I should react. And there's actually been a study that showed that chipmunks react appropriately to titmouse alarm calls too. So even mammals can kind of key into what the titmice are saying, which is pretty cool. And then in addition to alerting to predators, a lot of birds use calls to communicate in other ways, many of which we don't fully understand. Like some birds might be peeping constantly while they're feeding, like shorebirds on a mudflat, or you might hear birds squabbling at each other at a feeder, or maybe geese calling constantly when they're flying together in a flock. And there's a huge variety in the different noises that birds can make. So why bother learning them is the next question. And I think that the best answer here is that it helps you get so much more in tune with the birds around you. Once you learn what these birds sound like, you start noticing them in all kinds of places, even when you're not specifically birding. So here is a fun example. This is me eating very stale birthday cake for breakfast at a campsite on top of a mountain in Arizona last year. And I'm very, very focused on eating my birthday cake. I am not using my binoculars. I have binoculars, I'm not using them. But just by listening, I could hear all kinds of birds around me, like nuthatches and Mexican jays and towhees and Grace's warblers. And that's a beautiful thing, just to know what's around me without being able to see it. But the cool thing was, while I was up here listening and eating my cake, I heard something I didn't recognize, which made me finally put the cake down and then go look. And I ended up finding this very cute little buff-breasted flycatcher, which was a life bird for me. So that was really neat. This is something I don't think I would have noticed if I didn't know the songs of other birds and didn't know that something was different here. I should go check it out. And I think that really summarizes why did we make Sound ID. Knowing what noises birds make can really help you understand your surroundings and birds themselves so much better. But the process of learning bird sounds can be really overwhelming. So just in the United States, there are over 700 species of bird that you could find, and each of those makes a huge variety of different noises. So it can be really hard to figure out where to start learning sound. So we want Merlin to be a way for anybody anywhere in the world to learn more about the birds around them, whether they're already experienced birders or whether they're just getting started. So how do you use Merlin? Well, Merlin is an app available for your phone or your tablet. It works on iPhone and Android phones, also on tablets, and there's also a desktop version available for Apple computers. So the very first thing to do if you want to use it is download it, of course, off of the App Store or the Google Play Store. Next, if you want to have photos and descriptions and sounds included in your copy of Merlin, you'll need to download the bird pack for the area that you're planning on birding in. So for New York, we would recommend the United States Northeastern pack, or just the whole United States pack. If you've got a little extra room on your phone, you don't mind downloading a bigger file. You can download everything. Nothing's stopping you from downloading the whole world, but it is a lot. It would be a very large file. We now have photos and descriptions for 10,000 different species, which is pretty cool that Merlin is now a global field guide. And then if you would like to save your sightings that you find using Merlin, you will need to create an account with Cornell Lab. And if you are already using eBird or something else with Cornell, you can use that same username and password to log into Merlin. You don't need to make a separate account. And then there's a few different options within Merlin. You can use the first big Start Bird ID button to identify a bird using a description. It'll ask you a few questions that you answer, like multiple choice, and it'll tell you a list of what birds it thinks you might be seeing. Photo ID works just like you think it does. You can just take a picture of the bird and Merlin will tell you what bird that it thinks it is. And then Sound ID is a really cool way to identify birds by sound. So I am just checking my computer's settings here to make sure sound will play. I have a short video next. Okay, it should work. Let me know if it doesn't. All right, so here is an example of what Sound ID looks like when you're using it outside. We'll pretend it's maybe late May, you're birding in New York, you can hear all these birds singing, but it can be really tricky to see them. So walking along and eventually you'll stop and see, pull Merlin out and give it a try. Yeah, so that's so fun. That's like, it's like totally magical. Every time I use Merlin, it's just really fun to use. And it can really help you detect other birds in the area that you might not see otherwise. So when you start up Sound ID, the first thing you'll probably notice is that spectrogram that's scrolling across the top of the screen. And that is just a visual representation of sound, of bird song, where you have time along the x-axis at the bottom here, and frequency along the y-axis. So noises that are higher pitched are up higher, and noises down that are deeper are a little bit down lower on the spectrogram here. And these spectrograms are really fun. Different noises make different shapes on the spectrogram. And if you look at enough spectrograms, you can start to figure out what those noises might sound like if you were to hear them. So I just have a few examples here, like this very short, very compressed song of the Henslow's sparrow. You can see how like short that visualization is there. And then compare that to this very complicated song of the black-capped vireo. Yeah, so each different noise makes a slightly different shape on a spectrogram. And I love working with other folks down the hall from me in the Macaulay Library at Cornell, who spend so much time looking at these spectrograms that they can almost identify different species just by looking at the spectrogram, which is really fun. So as it's listening, Merlin will show you best matches for what it thinks the bird might be, and it'll note which species are uncommon or rare, or which species are already on your life list too. And when you stop the recording, you'll be able to explore the matches that Merlin found and compare what you heard with their songs in the field guide portion of the app that'll show up right here. So if Merlin detected a black-throated green warbler, you can click on black-throated green and then compare the song within Merlin to the songs that we have provided that others have recorded that are just in Merlin as a field guide, which can really help you learn. And a lot of birds make a lot of different sounds at different times of the year, and some species might even sound different in different parts of the range. Like the Carolina wrens up here in Ithaca sound very, very different from the Carolina wrens that I had near my home just a few months ago down in Georgia. So that's been a really interesting observation. And The sounds that we've chosen to include here in Merlin we try to make them be as representative of the species as possible. So this black-throated green, even though you probably know like what their like standard song sounds like, they make a whole bunch of different noises. So we tried to include as many different variations within this field guide as possible. And then once you're confident that, yes, I definitely heard, I saw black-throated green, you can report this either within Merlin or straight to eBird. Merlin will ask you which one you would prefer to submit this observation to. And we recommend, if you're already using eBird, we recommend submitting it through eBird and always submitting a full checklist if you can. Or you can also choose to save through Merlin, and it'll then prompt you to select a location and then have a really cute like life bird animation that'll pop up, and then save it to your life list. So the recordings that you make on Merlin, when you save the recording, it's only saved to your phone. It's not automatically uploaded to us at Cornell, but you can share them with us. You can submit them to your eBird checklist. We really, really encourage you to do that. And I'll talk more about that later. But when you're using Merlin, everything that you do is just saved onto your phone. When you submit a species, that gets uploaded to your eBird account, but otherwise the recordings just live on your phone until you choose to submit them to us. And when you're using Merlin, we always encourage you to confirm what you're hearing, because Merlin is still learning and it's not 100% accurate all the time. And I'll go into much more detail about this later too. But also, I think the best way to learn sounds is by actually seeing the bird that's making the noise. And I know that's not always possible. Sometimes this black-throated green is way up in the canopy and there's no way you're seeing that bird, no matter how hard you try. And that's okay. But trying to get your eyes on the bird is best. And if you can't see the bird, we recommend really trying to like digging through those recordings that you can look at in the field guide and comparing them to what you heard to really confirm what you see before you choose to submit this to eBird. Merlin currently covers just over 1,000 species of birds in the world, which is super exciting. It includes pretty much every bird that you could possibly hear singing in the US and Canada and Europe, and also includes common and widespread birds of Central and South America and common widespread birds of India. We just released an additional 200 birds last month, bringing the total up to this 1,054 species. And we have a list of these species on our website and in the app if you're interested in looking through it to see exactly which species are in there or which ones aren't in there yet, which is also interesting. So here's a different way to visualize that. This is a map of what that looks like right now. So the darker the green the country is on this map, the higher the percentage of birds in that country are currently covered by sound ID. So you'll notice that every country here is at least a little bit green, which means that at least a few birds in every country in the world can be identified with sound ID. And a lot of those birds are birds like the sanderling or northern pintail that can be found in many, many parts of the world. Like northern pintail can be found pretty much everywhere in the northern hemisphere. So if you're in the middle of Europe and you hear a pintail, Merlin will still call it a pintail, same as it would as if you were in the United States. And it works on other things like house sparrow, which is, I'm sure you all know, found in most parts of the world now, and even things like chaffinches in New Zealand. So no matter where you are in the world, if you use sound ID, it can identify some of the birds, but not all of them. But if you are in the US, Canada, or Europe, Merlin should be able to identify pretty much anything that you hear outside. So sound ID is an incredible tool that can already help you identify over 1,000 birds, and we're working on adding more in there too. But how does it work? Like, what does it look like behind the scenes? And this has been really cool to learn about. This is still very new to me. So I think the easiest way to explain it is to first explain how photo ID works. So if you're not already familiar, you can use Merlin to identify birds in a photo that you take. So all you have to do is get your photo onto your phone. You can either if you can just take a grainy cell phone photo. If there's a bird over there, even a grainy photo works pretty well with Merlin. Or if you have a nicer camera, you can send the photo to yourself, or even just take a picture of the back of your camera screen. That works really well too. And Merlin can identify just over 8,000 species by photo, and we're working on improving that as well too. We've just added a few new members to our machine learning team, which we're really excited about. Some of them are going to be working on some more photo ID stuff, so stay tuned there. And photo ID works using, like I just said, machine learning and computer vision to identify birds in photos. So this is very complicated. A lot of this is like way over my head, but it's a really cool process. And long story short, this works. This is how this works. So we've trained a computer model using images of birds that were annotated. So we had hundreds of volunteers draw boxes around birds in over 1 million photos, just like this example here. So with enough, like drawing enough boxes around enough birds in enough photos, we can train a computer model to identify the species in the photo and then test it to see how accurate it is. So with this method, training the computer in this method, photo ID is correct 92% of the time. And that's including like good photos like this one, and also including like bad cell phone photos too. So that's something we're really proud of. And with our new members of our machine learning team, we're hoping to bump that number up even more. We use a really similar method to train sound ID. So remember our spectrograms, which are visual representations of bird noise. Just like with photo ID, we are taking that image, that spectrogram, and annotating where the birds are. So we're basically just we're doing the same thing. We're just drawing a box right over where the bird is. So right up here, we have this really long song of a black-throated green warbler. And then in the background, there are these, there's a red-eyed vireo singing here as well. That's in the background. It's a little bit more faint, but you can still kind of see it here. And this is not an easy task, as you can imagine. This really requires experts in sound ID to do this type of annotation, because you need to know and be able to recognize, without seeing the bird, by just hearing it, the main focal species in the recording, like the black-throated green here, and also be able to know what is singing in the background. We found that identifying the birds in the background of Merlin recordings, these recordings that we're annotating, really helps with the accuracy of Merlin. So that's really important. And we also don't want to accidentally be training Merlin to identify the wrong species. We don't want to make mistakes too when we're annotating. So we have a really awesome team of expert sound folks that are working on annotating as many of these recordings as possible. And then with enough of these annotated sound files, we can then train Merlin the same way we did with photo ID, train the computer model to recognize bird songs based on this image. So I want to show a closer look of what this looks like. So I have a video here of one of our team members, Matt Medler, who is annotating a sound recording of an elegant trogon. So this is sped up. This is, I think, twice the speed it normally is, though he is pretty quick. So he is first goal is to draw at least 5 boxes around the focal species, which is the trogon in this case. And then he's going back through now, and in purple here, he's noting birds that he hears in the background, which he's identified as a brown-crested flycatcher. And then sometimes there's a bird noise in the background. You know it's a bird, but you have no idea what species it is, and that's okay too. So we have an unknown bird tag that we use with that, and then that allows others to go back through later. If someone else maybe is more familiar with the birds of Arizona, they can go back through here and try to identify the unknown birds, or we can just leave it as unknown. And then the very last thing he'll do, which might be too quick to see right here in the blue, he draws a box around a spot in the recording where there are no birds calling. And that's also something we found that's really important to do. We need to train Merlin in what is a bird and also what is not a bird. I get a lot of questions of like, you know, can you train Merlin to identify chipmunks for me? Because chipmunks, especially me, they really trick me sometimes when I'm out birding and I hear a wacky noise and it ends up being a chipmunk or, you know, a mammal or a frog even. So in the future, it might be possible to train Merlin to do that if we get enough recordings of chipmunks and then have someone go through and annotate them. But for now, we're marking things like that as no bird. So Merlin knows, aha, I'm hearing something, but it is not a bird. I'm not going to say anything for that. So always exciting things. So when Merlin is listening, it's not really like listening. It's actually looking at the spectrogram image and then comparing what it sees to what it learned from those files that have been annotated. So Merlin looks at the spectrogram in 3-second long chunks. So here in this recording, Merlin can see that this first 3 seconds of the recording contains the song of a Western meadowlark. And then Merlin shifts the box over by 1 second and it checks again. So this box still contains that meadowlark that's singing, but it also contains a yellowthroat. And then it'll shift the box over again. and then check it again. So we still have that meadowlark. It's the same song, the same individual. We still have that yellowthroat, same one again, but we also have a second meadowlark singing. So this is what Merlin is doing constantly when you're using it on your phone outside. And sometimes you might see the bird like flash a little bit. So when it's flashing, it's when Merlin is shifting this box over and detecting that bird again. So this is how Merlin is working when you're using it outside. So when you're learning bird sounds on your own, you're probably going to find that some bird sounds are a lot easier to learn and remember than others are. So for example, the red-tailed hawk has a really distinctive call, which I'll play right now. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before. It's really distinctive. You can't really mistake it for anything else. There's really no other bird that sounds like this. But maybe the chip notes that this chestnut-sided warbler makes, I'll play this too. Like, that's not very distinct. That sounds like a lot of other different species, and that's probably something that would be much trickier to learn and remember than the red-tailed hawk. And we find that the same concept is true for Merlin. Some birds are easier for Merlin to identify than others. So how do we test this? So once we have a bunch of sound recordings annotated, we can test how well Merlin identifies the species. And this graph here is one way to visualize that. So this is showing how the American woodcock is performing in sound ID. So let's listen to the bird first. This is another distinct bird. So very distinctive song. I thought this would be fun to pick because they've made it back to Ithaca. We're very excited to have them back. And they're just cool birds, but it is a really distinctive noise. Not a lot of other birds sound like that. Almost sounds like a dog squeaky toy. And overall, this graph is telling me that Merlin is doing a good job of identifying American woodcock's calls. So how do I know that? So to interpret this a little bit more, we have two different things that we're measuring. So at the bottom here is recall, which is essentially how sensitive Merlin is to detecting the species. And then precision on the y-axis here is about how accurate it is. So if Merlin has low recall for the species, the precision, which is measured by these this red and blue line up here, Merlin has low recall, the precision is very, very high. It's at almost 100%. But if you get closer to like a high percentage for recall, the precision really, really drops over time. And this is a concept that's probably true for people too. So to put it into better context, if you're birding, if you personally, you're out bird watching and you only call out an identification to the group only for a bird, only at the times when you get a really good look at it and you're really confident in it, your recall is very low, but your precision is high. On the other hand, if you call out an ID for a bird, for every single bird that you see, even if you get a bad look at it or you're not very familiar with it, your recall is very, very high, but your precision is probably pretty low. You're probably misidentifying some of those. So there is a trade-off here. So we want Merlin to be sensitive enough that it detects the bird, but not so sensitive that it's calling out a bird for every tiny noise that it hears. We don't want it to make mistakes. So these guidelines here for recall and then horizontally for precision are standards that we've set for what we feel Merlin should be performing at. And the way that we interpret this graph is we are aiming for the curve of this graph to be contained within this rectangle in the top right corner. And that's exactly what we see here. So this curve up here in the top corner is telling me that Merlin is like confident and accurate in identifying American woodcock calls, which makes a lot of sense because you've heard how distinctive this call is. It would be hard for Merlin to confuse this with any other noise. And we've also used 172 different sound recordings to train Merlin for the species. So it's had a lot of training opportunity and it's performing very well. And like, this is what we're shooting for all birds, really. So the woodcock has a really distinctive voice. But what about species that sound very similar? So I have an example here of two species that are really difficult to tell apart, both visually and by song. We have the Cassin's vireo and the blue-headed vireo. They're really, really closely related, and they have really similar looking spectrograms at the bottom here because they sound really similar. So I'll play the Cassin's Vireo first. All right, and then I'll play the blue-headed vireo to compare it to. So they're pretty similar. Like there's maybe a little bit of a difference in quality between their voices, but they sound very similar, and their spectrograms look almost identical in some areas. Like those are very similar looking little squiggles there. So how does Merlin think about this? Just like humans have difficulty identifying these birds, Merlin does too. So you can see the curves here on these graphs. They don't quite make it into this box in the upper right corner, which is telling us that Merlin is struggling to identify these species in both cases here. But in a lot of cases like this, that low accuracy is okay because Merlin is using data from eBird checklists to determine what birds are most likely in the area that you're using it in. So even though these species sound very much alike, and even though Merlin isn't like quite at the level we would hope it to be yet, if you're using Merlin in New York, for example, it's never going to suggest a Cassin's vireo because that species is not found here in New York. Or if you're in California, for example, it's not going to suggest a blue-headed vireo because we don't have eBird checklists from California with blue-headed vireos on them. So this is why we always recommend having the location on your phone turned on when you're using Merlin, because if you don't have it turned on, you might get some really wacky, really inaccurate results if Merlin doesn't know where you are. And honestly, that can be kind of fun to play with sometimes. Like if you're, for example, like watching TV or something, like you might have Merlin running alongside, and sometimes there's bird noises in the background. And if you have your location turned off, it'll just start identifying the birds that it thinks it might be, which is interesting. Sometimes shows are filmed in different parts of the world, even in the same episode. So like you could get, like chaffinches and then goldfinches, in the same recording. So it's just kind of interesting to play with. So this is a map of locations of all checklists that have been submitted to eBird. So you can see that the US is really well covered. It's by far the brightest thing on this map because this is where we have the most eBird users in the world. And then Europe, India, Australia, New Zealand are really bright. And a lot of the rest of the world is still pretty dark. And this is because there just aren't a lot of eBird users in these areas. And this is really what's powering Merlin. Merlin has a general idea, has a range map for each species, and knows generally where the species is found throughout the world. But I think the real power behind Merlin is that it can draw a list of likely species from right around where you are, from a very small area, and give you a list of what you're likely to see if you walk outside right now. And that's pretty cool. And that feature by far works the best in the United States and Europe, where we have the most eBird submissions. And it's working pretty well in other places too. But this is my call to you all to, wherever you're birding in the world, or even if you're just birding in your backyard, submitting eBird checklists really, really helps. Every single checklist that we add, even in really well-covered areas, helps us better understand where in the world different birds can be found, which in turn helps Merlin too. I get a lot of questions about mimics, which is another really fun case to look into. So here is our northern mockingbird. And if you've ever heard of mockingbirds sing, you know that they're really good at mimicking. They can sound exactly like the species that they're mimicking. So this graph here in general is showing us that Merlin has a pretty good chance of correctly identifying the song as a mockingbird, but it also has a really good chance of identifying the bird that it's mimicking. So it's pretty cool. Again, another fun thing to test. If you, next time you hear a mockingbird, pick up Merlin and try to record it and check out and see if it can detect it as a mockingbird. But also Merlin has a really good chance of identifying the birds that are contained within the mockingbird song. So the last talk that I did, I had an awesome 11-year-old girl that was getting into birding who shared with me that she used Merlin on a mockingbird in her backyard, and it identified the mockingbird, but it also identified 10 other species that the mockingbird was mimicking, which is super cool. So in cases like this where not just for mockingbirds, but for other birds, where this performance is not as high as we would hope it to be, this is nowhere near being in this top right corner. In general, the solution is to annotate more sound recordings, and then train Merlin again with additional recordings that capture the full range of noises that the bird can make. And the challenge with mimics is that you really can't fully capture the full range of noises it can make, because every single mockingbird sounds different. Every mockingbird is coming up with its own array of different noises that it's mimicking. So we can do our very best. We can annotate as many sound recordings as possible, and we can bump that accuracy up. But this is still a challenge that we're working on. And right now there are over, I think we're approaching 500 different sound recordings for mockingbird that have been annotated, that have been used to train Merlin. And to give you a comparison, the average is around like 120, 150 per species. So this is already over twice the effort as a lot of other species. So definitely a work in progress, and a really fun challenge for our machine learning team. So Sound ID is still pretty new, and it's come a really long way since it was introduced about 2 years ago now. So what's next? What are the fun and exciting things coming up? So overall, we want to improve the species that are currently in Sound ID. So you've seen some birds are performing really well. Merlin's doing a great job of identifying them, but we could work on the accuracy of some other species. So that's something we're working on, improving as many as we can, which means annotating as many sound recordings as we can. And we also want to expand Sound ID to new species across more regions. So we just expanded by about 200 species. That was awesome. Right now we've switched focus to, we're still annotating as many things as we can, but the new focus, rather than adding species right now, we're trying to improve the species that are currently in there. Other things in Merlin that are coming up, we are about to release a bird pack for the Philippines, which is super cool. If anybody has travel plans to the Philippines in the future, that bird pack should be out soon. And that's one of the last few bigger regions that don't have a bird pack yet. So that's really exciting. So that will bump up the number of birds covered in Merlin to over 10,000 of the 10,900 species in the world. And we are working on getting the rest of those last few hundred species up and into Merlin. A lot of the remaining species are like birds that are like endemic to like 1 or 2 tiny islands out in the Pacific, like really difficult to find, difficult to photograph and record birds. So we're working on it, hoping to get as many birds into Merlin as possible. But the challenge with Sound ID is that we need a lot of sound recordings to make this possible. So for each species, we need a bare minimum of 100 good sound recordings to be able to consider starting the process of annotating them to train Merlin. And for most species, we need many, many more to train Merlin to a high enough accuracy. Like I said, the mockingbird already has taken over 400 recordings, and even the woodcock has taken over 100. It's not just that minimum of 100. So as an example here, our red-winged blackbird has a really wide range of noises that it can make. It has a really distinctive song, but it makes all kinds of other calls and other vocalizations that that are really beautiful. But to train Merlin to identify all those different noises, we need sound recordings that represent all those different noises. We can't just train it on its song and expect it to be able to identify the calls as well. We need a little bit of everything to train Merlin with. And the good news for the red-winged blackbird is that in the Macaulay Library, we have over 8,000 sound recordings of this species, which is awesome. So all of the sound recordings that we use to train Merlin come from the Macaulay Library, which is where your photos and recordings get archived when you submit them to your eBird checklist. So we're very thankful that over 8,000 recordings have been submitted for this species, because for a bird with this dynamic of a voice, we need those recordings to be able to train Merlin to be accurate enough. But a lot of species don't have a lot of recordings yet. Even relatively common species here in the United States, like the scaled quail, only has 131 recordings in the Macaulay Library. And the black rosy finch, which, to be fair, this is a very difficult to access species, but there are only 79 recordings for this bird. So this is not a species we can add to Sound ID yet. And we're especially in need of recordings of birds outside of the US and Europe. So here's a list of just a few countries. Try to pick countries from a few different parts of the world, and the number of species in each country that already have the minimum of 100 recordings available to us. So you can see this is going to be our biggest challenge. We want to include as many species around the world in Merlin as possible. But for most species in most countries, that just isn't possible yet. So this is where you all come in. So by far the best way to help us is to record the birds that you hear when you're out birding and submit them in your eBird checklist. And recordings for any species can help, even for already well-represented species, like our friend, the red-winged blackbird. More recordings help us make Merlin even more accurate. So we have an awesome sound recording course available on the Bird Academy website through Cornell. The course is self-guided. It's about 7 hours long. It goes into great detail about every part of the recording and editing process. And I don't have 7 hours to spend with you right now to share all of this information with you, but I do have a few tips from the course that I want to share. So how do you record bird sounds? If you're new to sound recording, just like I am, it can be kind of confusing to know where to start. But the good news is it doesn't have to be complicated. Sound recording has come a very long way in the last 100 years, to the point where the easiest option right now is to just use your phone. So Merlin does a really good job of recording bird noise. And we would love for you to use Merlin, record the birds you hear, and then submit them to eBird. One thing to note here is that your phone's built-in microphone isn't very directional. So rather than picking up the noise it's hearing in one specific direction, it's picking up noises from all around you, and which is really, really helpful when you're using Merlin. If you're out birding, you do want your phone to be doing this. You want your phone to be able to pick up the birds in front of you and behind you and to the side. And Merlin does a great job of doing that. Your phone's microphone is designed for that. But that also means that it picks up a lot of background noise as well. So it's not just picking up the bird that's over there, it's also picking up you and maybe your heavy breathing, or you're stomping on the ground or shifting your hand on your phone. So Merlin does a great job. When you record with Merlin, you don't have to worry about things like the file type or anything. It's already in the correct file format. You can even kind of look at the spectrogram and get a little bit of feedback while you're recording. You can know ahead of time, if there's a lot of background noise or whatnot. So it's a great way to get started. And these recordings are really useful, super, super useful to us. But if you do want to get a little bit more into recording, there are a lot of different types of equipment that you can get. The next step up would be a shotgun microphone. And I have one here, just so you can see the size of it. So this, Zoom is doing some interesting things to my face here. So this is a shotgun microphone. So it's pretty small. It's very lightweight. You might need like a windscreen like this, which you can stick over the top of the microphone to help with background noise. And there should be some kind of like grip that you can use to attach the microphone so you can hold it really easily while you're, there we go, while you're out in the field. So this is super lightweight. Doesn't take a lot of effort for me to hold up, and something like this can connect to my phone if I want to use it with Merlin, or if you want a higher quality recording and a little bit more control over what you're doing, you can use a dedicated recorder just like this, super small, super lightweight, and this setup will get you really, really high quality recordings, like much, much higher quality than just with your phone. There are all types of options available for shotgun microphones. There are some lower, some cheaper ones that are around $100 or so that plug right into your phone that give you a significant jump in quality from just your phone's internal microphone, and then going up to like almost $1,000 or so, depending on how much you're able to spend. But in general, any of these, even like the lower end options, are going to be a big improvement in quality over your phone. And then, and then the benefit of the shotgun microphone is sort of like its name describes, it's very directional. So rather than picking up sounds to the sides of you and behind you, the shotgun microphone is really only picking up sounds that are directly in the path of it. So whatever you're pointing at is what the microphone is picking up, which really reduces background noise, which is what makes that higher quality. And then the most expensive but highest quality option for microphones are these microphones with a parabolic dish attached to it. So the shape of this dish makes this microphone really directional. It's really good at focusing in on an individual bird that's singing. And the shape of the dish also amplifies the noise that bird is making. So even if there are other birds calling nearby, whatever you're pointing the dish at, the microphone at, that bird will be the loudest and the clearest, which is really cool. And this is the type of equipment that most of those really nice, very high quality sound recordings that you find as examples in the field guide portion of Merlin are made with. It's this type of equipment. I also realize this is way out of most people's like budget for hobbies. This is not something we expect all of you to go out and do, but I did want to share this just to share like what the cost is for something like this. And no matter what type of microphone you're using, even if you're using Merlin on your phone, in general, you're going to get much better quality recordings if you try to stay as quiet as possible and get as close to the bird as possible. So when you're using a microphone or Merlin, you are the closest thing to your microphone. So you want to try not to talk when you're recording or try not to shuffle your feet and really try to minimize the amount that you're handling your equipment or your phone so you don't get all kinds of clunking noises in your recording. And it also helps quite a bit to get closer to the bird. And of course, you don't want to disturb the bird. The bird's safety comes first here in this case. We don't want to interfere with what the bird is doing. And we also want it to keep singing if we're trying to record it. We don't want it to stop making noise. So in this case, if you're recording a bird, general best practice is to try to record from far away first, and then stop, and then walk a little bit closer, and then try to get another recording of that bird. If you're using Merlin or any other method to record birds, we would love for you to share those with us, which sharing those, we'll add those to the Macaulay Library and then in turn help Merlin learn. So to do that, you'll first need to get the recording onto your computer, which you can do using the share button right here in Merlin. And then once it's on your computer, you'll need to trim it so that you're just including when the bird is singing. Like, for example, if you've made like a 10-minute long recording, but the bird is only singing for the last 30 seconds of it, we only need those last 30 seconds. We don't need the, the other 9 minutes of you talking with your friend and walking through the woods. We just want the part where the bird is singing. And then we ask that you normalize the volume, and then you could submit it to eBird. So you can add the recordings right to your eBird checklist the same way that you would add photos with that little add media button here. And then when you submit it, it gets added to the Macaulay Library, which now has over 1.7 million recordings of birds, which is incredible because most of these were submitted by birders, just like you, who were submitting them to eBird checklists. And it really is birders who we want to thank for the success of Merlin so far. We have a really amazing community of partner organizations and birders and photographers and sound recordists all around the world that are working together to help us build Merlin and work on all the other conservation initiatives that are led by Cornell, all because we want to make the world a better place for birds. And that is all I have for you today. And I am very happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Alli. I saw one question show up in the chat and then it disappeared. The question, as I recall, was, is there a bird pack for Thailand?
Oh, I don't know. I think that is on the list for a pack that we're planning on releasing this coming year. Let me hold on. I'm checking my copy of Merlin right now. Not yet. That is on the list after the Philippines. It is a work in progress.
Excellent. Thank you.
I can see the chat now.
Yeah.
If anybody has questions. And also, if anyone has questions after the fact, my email address is on the slide right here. If anybody needs to reach out, happy to talk to you.
I see a question in the chat now. You got that one, Alli?
Ooh, okay. So is there contextual information Merlin can use, like time of day or duration of singing, that would help it distinguish difficult cases? That's a great question. As far as I know right now, Merlin is not using things like the time of day, which honestly might be useful for things like owls or nocturnal birds. It's just looking at what it is seeing within that 3-second chunk of the recording and then comparing that to the list of likely birds that it pulls from eBird and to what it remembers from being trained with annotations. So right now, that is not part of Sound ID, but that's a really interesting idea. I like that.
Okay, there's another question there from Ken.
Yes, what file format to upload? I can find and then put in the chat here. We have a on Cornell's website, we have a guide to best sound recording and editing practices that I can share that has a lot more information on it.
Okay. And questions are rolling in now. So
Yes, so when recording with Merlin, it highlights the bird ID when playing it back. It highlights the bird ID, but it does not highlight it when playing it back. Is it possible to do that? Yes, stay tuned for the next update of Merlin. We're actually testing that in the beta version right now. So stay tuned, maybe another week or so. That will be the next feature we add. Yes. Yeah, we're super excited. That's been a really, like, we all wanted that too. So we're super excited that our developers had time to add that in. We're excited.
Okay.
Good question. Is it helpful for us to know when Merlin misses an obvious bird? If it misidentifies it or doesn't capture it? It is useful. If it's a bird that is in sound ID, like we know, like, for example, if it misses a cardinal and like we know cardinal is included in sound ID, that could be really interesting for our sound ID team to look at. So if that does happen and you're able to, if you could send that sound recording to the Merlin help desk, there's like the help button in the app. You can send it that way or email it to, it's merlinhelp@cornell.edu. Sending us the recording that it missed that bird in is really helpful for our sound ID team to take a look at.
Okay. It's interesting. Some people are answering other people's questions, but one question that got skipped was, does Merlin work better with some cell phones than others?
That's a good question. It shouldn't. It's the same model that's being used on everyone's phone. If anything, some phones might have better microphones than others. So if you have an older phone, then your microphone might not be as powerful as newer ones. But in general, we haven't noticed any major differences between different models of phones. Like, it works pretty much just the same on Android and iPhone. We haven't noticed any differences there.
There's another one that seems a little more technical. It says, please explain what recall is on the accuracy graphs. Also explain the label masks, true and false.
Yes, so can you still see my screen here?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna flip back really fast to one of the graphs here. Okay, so I think the woodcock was a good example. Okay, so the recall in general is how often Merlin will say the species. Recall is, sorry, moving the chat over a little bit. So recall is about how sensitive Merlin is to saying the species. So recall, when recall is high, Merlin is very likely to say there's a woodcock there. So like if you, for example, if you had 100 recordings of a bird and Merlin said there's a woodcock there 90 times out of the 100, your recall would be 0.9. And then precision is the accuracy. So if of the 100 times that it identified a woodcock, if it was correct 80 times, then the precision would be 0.8. And then you did note that there are two different color lines on this graph here with true and false with masking. And that is with and without using eBird data. So if Merlin does not have access to your location and cannot determine the list of likely birds for your area, that is what this red line is showing. So in general, it's a little bit less accurate than if you did give Merlin access to your location, and it does have the ability to find a list of likely birds from eBird. That is represented by the blue line here, which in general, that makes Merlin much more accurate because it has a much shorter list of birds that it can pull the identification from.
Donna, does that answer your question?
I know it's a complicated concept. It's definitely still something
pretty much. If I was giving this talk to a lay audience, I would certainly spend more time trying to explain what that graph is all about, because I'm a scientist, retired, and I didn't get it the first time through what it was. So thank you.
Thank you. This is very new to me too, and I'm still learning how to interpret this. So that's useful feedback. Thank you.
I'm looking through some of the others that are on the list. So what happens if the sound submitter misidentifies the bird making the sound?
So is the question like, if you like, what happens if you submit it to eBird, but you're wrong? Is that what the question is?
Steve, is that what that question is getting at?
Yes, that's the question.
Yes, yeah, so in general, we never want Merlin to be the only source of information you're using to identify a bird by sound. We want Merlin, just like your field guide, to be part of your wider toolkit that you have available to you when you're out birding. So if you think you have a bird identified, especially if it's a rare bird and you're not 100% sure what it is, we would really recommend going back through and listening to as many different recordings of that species as possible and making sure you save that recording so you have that bird recording saved so that you can go back and listen to it. And then maybe sharing with a few friends, getting some second opinions is always helpful. And then ultimately it's up to your local reviewer. So if you are unsure if you are identifying the bird correctly and you want to submit it to eBird, always include that sound recording with it so that it's available to us at Cornell and also to your local eBird reviewer to listen to that recording themselves and then confirm that.
Okay. Alli, there's 2 more new questions that just came in. If you look at the last 2, they're a little long, so I don't want to bore people by reading it out loud.
Yes, so Harold is asking if the machine learning side of Merlin will allow it to make like an educated guess on a bird ID based on like the general quality of the sound, even if it's never heard a song like that before. And in general, that's kind of a hard to answer question. So yes and no. It's comparing what it sees in the spectrogram to annotations that we've given it from other sound recordings. So we try because bird spectrograms are going to look a little bit different every time. They're not always going to be a beautiful, like crisp, clean line. There's always going to be a little bit of variation in it. So Merlin does have the ability to identify birds, even if it's not like 100% identical to the annotations that we've given it. But there is a limit to that. And I don't know where that limit is. That's a better question for our machine learning team. And I'm happy to ask them that as well. But right now Merlin does not have the ability to identify to like a family. So it will identify like a wood thrush or a hermit thrush, but it won't ever say just like, I think this is a thrush of some sort. And that's something we've talked about maybe adding in the future. It's not on the list at the moment, but that's maybe something else, maybe what your question is trying to get at too. That's maybe possible in the future.
Okay. There was another question about downloading the recordings from Merlin to eBird. Is it possible to do it without downloading to your computer? Can the file just be downloaded from the phone?
Yes, so you can submit straight from eBird on your phone, straight from Merlin on your phone to eBird. You'll need to, if you're using an iPhone, your recordings on your phone are saved into the app. So you'll need to download the recording from the Merlin onto your phone and then submit that to eBird. But if you can, we always recommend editing the recording just a little bit, just to trim the recording. So if you're able to get like a really nice recording, that's only as long as the bird is singing and you're happy to submit that to eBird, that's awesome. You can do that from your phone. But it's a lot easier on the computer and it's a lot easier to edit on the computer as well. So you can't edit recordings in Merlin. That's something that we've been talking about as a team of hoping to add into the future. Because this is it's a process to get the recordings from Merlin onto your computer and then edit and then submit it. It's a lot of steps. And I think we lose some people along the way. So we're in the future hoping to add an editing feature into Merlin. No idea what the timeline looks like on that, but it's on our minds. But for now, we do on our website and our help desk have an article about that outlines the process of doing it. If you want to read a little bit more, I can share that with you as well.
Yeah, because there are questions on if there's a tutorial for how to use the Merlin features. So if there was any instructional information that you could provide us even after the fact, we could probably share that somehow with folks.
Yes, yeah, no, I'd be happy to.
Okay. How many people are on the Merlin team at the moment?
That's a good question. That's also very hard to answer. So there's probably, so like everyone within the Macaulay Library works on Merlin in some way. And then there's probably like 20 other people at the lab that all work on Merlin as part of their job, but not as their main job. So in total, there's probably like 25 to 30 people that have their hands in Merlin in some way. And then maybe like 10 of us or so total that where it's our full-time job. So it's a lot of people. And then that doesn't include annotators and partners all around the world too. So it's a big team.
All right. A similar question to the one that was asked before. Sometimes Merlin doesn't pick up sounds, even though there's obviously birds around. It'll come back with just nothing, won't come back at all. So the question is this related to the phone or something else?
Yeah, that could be a few things. If Merlin is not hearing some birds, but is hearing others, that's a case where we would love for you to send us directly that recording so we can take a closer look and help you through it. It could also be maybe your phone, for some reason, Merlin doesn't have permission to access your microphone. That's a common problem. Or if it's a very recent problem after the most recent sound update. We have noted that there's a bug that's affecting some phones where Sound ID just stops working for some reason. We don't know what's causing that yet, but it seems to be resolved either by just restarting your phone or deleting and reinstalling the app, which is a pain, but it has been fixing it. So if it's a recent problem, could be that. If you do have a problem with that, email the Merlin Help Desk. If you do email the Merlin Help Desk, you get to me. So I'm in charge of keeping track of that. So please reach out that way. Happy to help.
Okay. A few more questions. One was, I don't know if this is really a question, but just kind of a pondering. I wonder if Merlin could be used to generatively produce perhaps novel bird song, and how would birds react? Not really a question so much as a pondering.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That's another great question for our machine learning team.
Okay. What's the best application for editing sound? So you'd mentioned one time normalizing sound. That's not a phrase familiar to me, but what application would be good to use for editing sound?
Yes, so for editing on your computer, there's a few different options. A free one the program is called Audacity. A lot of people at the lab use that. It's free, it's really easy to use. That's the one that we would recommend if it's your first time editing. And there are more recommendations on our Sound ID like FAQ page that I can send to you all.
Great. And the last question I see right now is, where does funding come to support the Merlin team?
Yeah, a little bit of everywhere. A lot of it is funded by memberships to the lab, donations directly to the lab, directly to the Merlin Project. There are a few grants that we're running off of as well, but it's a little bit of everything, just like a lot of other projects at the lab.
All right. There are a few questions that were answered by other participants. Are there any other questions that I skipped, or that you have you wish to have a better answer provided directly from Alli?
Yep, and my email address is right up here. I saw someone just asked for it. Happy to answer questions that way too. And our next Merlin happening, we are planning on doing a webinar this June 9th. That will be with probably me and a few others, hoping to get some representation from our machine learning team as well, to get deeper into the technical parts of Merlin. So more announcements will go out about that from Cornell. But yeah, stay tuned for a bigger webinar in that way.
Fantastic. Any other questions before we end the recording and conclude the meeting? Well, I know I learned a few new things about Merlin today that I'm excited to go and play with. So, yep, we've got many people, many thanks, applause, appreciation. Thank you so much, Alli. This was really, really helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.